Imagine looking at your bank account and seeing, not just a collection of currency, but literal ammunition stockpiled for a cultural war.
Yeah, that's a pretty intense way to look at it.
It is, right. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are unpacking an exclusive, ultra long, and just incredibly incisive review of a fascinating new ebook.
And it's definitely a manual that completely redefines the concept of personal wealth.
Oh, absolutely. It's called Army of Capital: Masculine Saving, Building, Stewarding, and Dominion by Conrad Riker. And honestly, the strategies and the concepts we're about to cover are so dense and compelling. You're going to want to grab a copy for yourself just to see how these mechanics work on paper.
Yeah, you really need to see the text to fully grasp it.
Exactly. You can find the ebook right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books. And hey, while you're at it, do us a quick favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to the show so you never miss out on the incredible source material we unpack here for you.
So, getting right into it, this is a highly provocative text. And to really understand it, we need to be explicitly clear up front about the target audience and, the foundational framework of the book.
Right. Who is this actually written for?
Well, Army of Capital is written specifically for a men's rights activist audience and for red-pilled manosphere men. The entire premise of Riker's book rests on this argument that our modern financial, corporate, and cultural institutions have been, in his view, entirely captured by feminists and Marxists.
That's a massive claim to base a financial book on.
It is. And his goal is basically to help his readers understand the history of our institutions before that alleged capture happened, and then build strategies to operate outside of those compromised systems.
And that context is absolutely critical for you listening. As we navigate this material, we need to state our mission very, very clearly. We're impartially reporting on this politically charged content.
Right, exactly.
Our role on this deep dive is not to take sides. We're not endorsing these viewpoints, and we're not condemning them either. We are simply serving as your neutral guides to unpack the ideas, the financial tactics, and the worldview contained strictly within the original source material.
Yeah, we're basically just looking at the architecture of his argument.
Yeah.
We're examining how Riker fuses this really aggressive, almost militaristic financial strategy with traditional masculine philosophy, biological essentialism, and spiritual warfare.
Right, so let's start at the bedrock of that architecture. Because before the book even touches a single dollar, it establishes a very specific cosmic worldview. The author roots his financial advice in a blend of Christopher Langan's CTMU and ancient Manichaeism.
Yeah, because
Which is a lot. Let's unpack that, because CTMU is an incredibly dense concept.
it really is. CTNU stands for the Cognitive Theoretic Model of the Universe. And in wildly oversimplified terms, Langan's theory posits that reality is a self-processing, self-simulating mind. It's a framework where the universe has a specific syntax, like a structural logic to it. And Riker takes that concept and blends it with Manichaeism, which is this ancient religion that views all of existence as a strict, dualistic struggle between light and darkness, or order and chaos.
So how does he map that highly abstract cosmic struggle onto, modern gender roles and wealth building? Because those seem like very different arenas.
Well, in Riker's framework, traditional gender roles aren't just social constructs. He argues they are the actual syntactic rules of the universe.
Interesting.
Yeah. The book argues that men are biologically and spiritually designed to be active, universal operators. Their mandate, and he draws really heavily from Genesis here, is to subdue the earth, to build structures, and conquer chaos. Women, within this specific text, are designed as receptive helpers.
I see.
And the author argues that attempting to rewrite this biological and cosmic code is the literal root cause of modern societal collapse.
It's an incredibly rigid framework, and it leads to what the author calls the modern double bind. The book points out this statistical paradox. Society absolutely relies on raw male strength to function. The text cites that 93% of workplace fatalities are men, and 92% of critical infrastructure is built by men.
Yeah, the heavy physical lifting of civilization.
Exactly. Yet, Riker argues, society simultaneously shames that exact same strength, labeling the drive to conquer and build as toxic masculinity.
Operating from that premise, he paints it as a totally lose-lose scenario for men. You are demanded to provide the physical and structural scaffolding of society, but you're penalized for possessing the aggressive traits required to do that building.
And this ties directly into his really aggressive stance against the modern cultural push for men to be vulnerable, right?
Oh, absolutely. The book goes incredibly hard against the idea of men opening up. He actually points to Harvard studies indicating that men who display vulnerability in the corporate workplace suffer severe career and promotion penalties compared to their female peers.
So the insight here is that within this worldview, vulnerability isn't therapeutic. It's a strategic weakness that adversaries will exploit.
Exactly. The text shares a really visceral anecdote about a highly decorated Navy SEAL combat veteran.
Right, the custody battle story.
Yeah. This man went through court-ordered therapy during a custody dispute and opened up about his combat PTSD. And instead of receiving empathy, his vulnerability was weaponized against him.
The courts used his trauma as proof of instability, right? And he lost custody of his children.
Exactly. For Riker, this proves that vulnerability is just a luxury men simply cannot afford in a hostile system.
So if a man is operating in this supposedly hostile system, how does this cosmic and cultural battle translate to his wallet? Because the book quickly pivots from all this philosophy into what it calls financial trench warfare.
It translates into viewing every single financial decision as an act of war. The author frames saving money not as mere frugality or, just budgeting. He calls it a sacred duty.
A secret duty.
Yes, it's presented as literal neurobiological warfare against a consumer society that he claims wants to keep men docile, distracted, and indebted.
Which is a stark contrast to mainstream advice. He completely dismisses standard set it and forget it index fund investing, calling it a feminine fantasy. True dominion, in his eyes, requires active, tactile conquest.
Right, because to build an empire, you have to intimately know the terrain. He actually used the story of his own grandfather to illustrate this.
Oh, right, the parking empire in Detroit.
Yeah, his grandfather didn't buy diversified mutual funds. He built a parking empire by walking down Woodward Avenue until he had memorized every single pothole. He knew the physical reality of his investments, the traffic patterns, the decay of the concrete way better than anyone else. It's all about asymmetric local knowledge.
So if saving and building is claiming territory, how does he view debt? Is that seen as a surrender?
Debt is framed as an occupying army. It's literally referred to in the text as Satan's conscription notice.
Wow. Satan's conscription notice.
Yeah, because when you're in debt, you do not own your labor or your future. You've basically surrendered your autonomy to the very institutions he claims are compromised.
That makes sense within his framework. The book outlines a tactic called the debt avalanche and shares a story about a man who executed it. He listed out his credit cards by interest rate, targeted the worst offender, and basically poured every spare dollar into it like napalm.
But it's the aftermath of that story that really stands out.
Right, when he finally paid it off, he didn't just cut the card up with scissors, he physically burned the credit card in his barbecue grill. And he said the melting plastic smelled like victory.
That is a powerful psychological ritual of liberation. And once a man has liberated his territory from debt, the text instructs him to build his income infantry. This means establishing unbreakable cash flow. And one of the primary and perhaps most surprising tactics he talks about here is tithing.
Let's break down that insight. We usually associate tithing with giving 10% to a church. How is Riker weaponizing this concept?
Well, he applies a highly strategic compounding twist to it. The author references Malachi 3.0 there and the historical example of John D. Rockefeller, who famously tithed 10% from his very first paycheck. But Riker advises launching a 10% tithe missile directly into a brokerage account before paying any other bills.
So the psychological shift isn't just about saving 10%, it's about fundamentally recategorizing savings in your brain from a nice-to-have option at the end of the month to an absolute unbreakable religious mandate.
Yes.
It basically takes the emotion and the hesitation completely out of investing.
Precisely. It's about harnessing compound interest as a divine mathematical force to multiply your troops over time.
Which brings us to what the book calls the tax trenches. If building the income infantry is expanding your army, how does the author view the money the government extracts from you through taxes?
He views the tax code not as an inevitable burden, but as an arsenal for those smart enough to read the manual. The goal is to weaponize the enemy's liabilities against them.
He shares that famous example of Steve Jobs, right?
Yeah. Jobs leased Apple's massive Cupertino headquarters for exactly $1 annually. And he engineered this by structuring the lease as a community reinvestment asset based on local job creation.
So the text argues that rational men engineer these loopholes to preserve their capital. But let's clarify another specific tactic he mentions, which is converting a traditional IRA to a Roth IRA during a massive market downturn. For anyone listening who isn't deeply embedded in tax strategy, why exactly is doing this during a market crash so advantageous?
Okay, so in a traditional IRA, your money grows tax deferred, meaning you pay income tax when you pull it out in retirement.
Right.
But in a Roth IRA, you pay the taxes up front, and then all future growth and withdrawals are completely tax-free. If you convert a traditional to a Roth, you have to pay taxes on the current value of the account.
Got it. So Riker's strategy is to execute this conversion during a severe market crash.
Exactly. When your asset values are temporarily crushed, the tax bill on the conversion is significantly lower. Then, when the market inevitably rebounds, you capture all of that massive recovery growth entirely tax-free. He views it as turning market casualties into reinforcements.
That is an incredibly aggressive, opportunistic mindset, and that flows directly into how the author views the stock market as a whole. Chapter 6 is titled Market Maneuvers, and it heavily advocates for concentrated firepower over diversification.
He is deeply critical of diversification. He views it as a shield for those who don't actually understand what they're buying. Real builders take highly concentrated, calculated positions.
And he points to the 2021 GameStop event as the ultimate modern example of this. But hold on, before we look at the strategy there, let's explain the mechanics of that event for you guys. The book mentions that Wall Street hedge funds had shorted 140% of the stock's float. In plain English, what does that actually mean, and why was it a vulnerability?
Shorting a stock means an investor borrows shares they don't own, sells them at the current price, and hopes the price drops so they can buy them back cheaper, return the borrowed shares, and pocket the difference.
Right.
The float is the total number of shares available for public trading. In the case of GameStop, hedge funds were so greedy they had borrowed and sold short 140% of the available shares.
They sold more shares than actually existed.
Yes, it was a massive structural weakness.
And according to the book, retail investors identified that weakness and executed what he calls a righteous insurrection. They used asymmetric warfare, concentrating their buying power to drive the price up, which trapped the hedge funds who were then forced to buy shares at exorbitant prices just to cover their shorts.
They completely broke the institutional elites in that moment. But to pull off maneuvers like that, you need flawless intelligence. And that leads into the book's concept of rational reconnaissance, which applies the military OD loop to market data.
The OD loop. Observe, orient, decide, act. It's a decision-making cycle developed by fighter pilots.
Exactly. Riker shares this brilliant historical anecdote about the banker Nathan Rothschild in 1815. While the rest of the London financial elite were just waiting for official government dispatches about the outcome of the Battle of Waterloo, Rothschild had deployed a private, highly expensive network of carrier pigeons and fast horsemen across the English Channel.
So he received the intelligence that Wellington had defeated Napoleon hours before the London Stock Exchange even knew.
And because he had that asymmetric intelligence, he was able to manipulate the market, cause a panic, and then buy up assets for pennies on the pound, cementing a generational fortune. The book argues that modern men must build their own private intelligence networks and proprietary data feeds, their own modern carrier pigeons, basically, to outmaneuver institutional narratives.
And one of the institutional narratives the author targets most aggressively is corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI.
Yeah, this is a major pillar of his critique against modern institutions. The author views DEI as a system that inherently sacrifices competence at the altar of forced ideological equality.
He uses the tragic Boeing 737 MAX crashes as his prime example here. According to the text, Boeing prioritized diversity quotas and HR compliance over engineering excellence.
Right.
The book claims that experienced male engineers raised severe technical warnings about the MCS software, but were systematically overruled by an HR apparatus that was focused on diversity metrics rather than safety.
And for the author, this is the ultimate proof that when a society abandons pure meritocracy for ideology, the physical structures of civilization, in this case, airplanes, literally fall out of the sky.
Which brings us to a crucial pivot in the text. If the modern corporate world, the financial systems, and the legal courts are this fatally compromised by ideology, what is the structural alternative?
The answer, according to the final chapters, is building brotherhood brigades and generational strongholds.
Because if the existing systems are hostile, you have to build parallel economies. You can't rely on the banks or the courts.
Exactly. The text advocates for the creation of iron councils. These are mutual aid societies and business networks based entirely on high-trust male bonds.
There's an incredible example of this in the book. The author details a private lumber syndicate that has operated for 17 years without a single default. They don't use banks for capital. They don't use modern legal contracts because, as he says, paper contracts are just divorce papers waiting to happen.
Yeah, that was a great line.
Instead, they bypass the system entirely. They operate on handshake contracts sealed with a pour of bourbon and a .45 caliber cartridge.
It's a complete return to blood oaths and reputational stakes. If you default, you don't get sued.
Yeah.
You lose your reputation and your access to the Brotherhood entirely, which is far more devastating. But the book stresses that to maintain that level of trust and operational capability, the men themselves have to be forged into something harder.
He draws heavy parallels to the Spartan agoge here, so he's essentially advocating for that same brutal, state-sponsored physical conditioning of ancient Sparta, but applying it individually to modern neurochemistry.
Yes. The author pushes for intense voluntary physical and mental discipline. Practices like 72-hour wilderness fasts and daily ice-cold plunges. In his framework, this isn't just about physical fitness. It's about systematically destroying the psychological desire for modern comforts.
Right.
The book claims that enduring these extremes boosts testosterone, lowers cortisol, and builds the stoic resilience necessary to survive systemic collapse.
Because surviving a civilizational collapse is the ultimate goal of this army of capital. It's about building generational strongholds that will outlast the cultural decay.
Stewardship isn't just about your own lifetime. It's about the infrastructure you leave behind. And the author uses Andrew Carnegie as the ultimate archetype of this generational legacy.
Carnegie was a ruthless industrialist, but Riker respects what he did with his capital to arm the future.
He does. Carnegie spent $55 million, which was an unimaginable fortune at the turn of the 20th century, to build over 1,600 public libraries across the country. But the author emphasizes the intent behind them. He didn't fund what the book dismissively calls feminist salons. He stocked those libraries with texts on physics, engineering, philosophy, and classical strategy. He built literal intellectual armories, designed to arm future generations of men with the hard knowledge required to rebuild civilization from the ground up.
That is a massive, sweeping vision to wrap your head around. Let's synthesize what we've covered today. The book intertwines incredibly strict, militant financial protocols with an unapologetic, red-pilled worldview of masculine duty. The author is urging his reader to stop looking at capital as mere purchasing power and start understanding that every single dollar saved, invested, or withheld from the mainstream system is a bullet in a cultural war.
It is a totally comprehensive framework where compound interest, aggressive tax strategy, and high-trust brotherhoods are viewed as the last remaining fortifications against a society that the author believes is actively hostile to male nature and traditional order.
And as we wrap up our analysis, we want to briefly remind you one last time. The views, historical interpretations, and cultural critiques we've unpacked today belong solely to the author of the source material. Our mission on this deep dive is purely to analyze the architecture of these arguments and impartially report on the text, giving you the unfiltered core of the manual.
Because understanding these frameworks, regardless of where you stand personally, is absolutely essential for navigating the complex ideological landscape of modern finance and culture.
Absolutely. If you found the mechanics of this breakdown fascinating, you need to go directly to the source. Head over to Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks right now to buy the ebook. Trust me, there is so much more tactical depth in those pages that we couldn't even get to today.
And if you want to keep up with the author's ongoing analysis, market intelligence, and strategy, you should follow him on Substack at Conrad Riker.
And of course, please remember to hit that like button and subscribe to our deep dive so you're always in the loop when we break down the most impactful new material.
As we look at this entire framework, from Carnegie's intellectual armories to the lumber syndicates operating on handshakes, it's hard not to think about the historical precedent Riker uses to justify all this extreme preparation.
Yeah, the author points to a terrifying reality. During the hyperinflation crisis in Weimar Germany, fiat currency became so worthless that men literally burned wheelbarrows of cash in their stoves just to keep their families warm for the night. It proved violently that fiat money is ultimately an illusion.
It begs a lingering question for all of us. If the digital numbers on a screen and the institutional systems holding up modern money were to completely vanish tomorrow, what tangible physical assets, generational skills, and unbreakable alliances have you built that would actually survive the fire?
Something to think about. We'll see you next time.